My name is Michael Slind, and I'm a senior editor at Stanford Social Innovation Review. One of my duties in that role is to oversee a part of the magazine called Case Study. Every issue in that department, we take a close look at one organization. We kind of look beyond the general principles that are otherwise often the focus of parts of our magazine, and we look in, we examine in detail and at length how people at that one organization are reckoning with a particular challenge or opportunity. In our view, it's really an ideal way to understand what social innovation looks like on the ground. So I'm very excited about the next session that we're going to have for you. It is a case study, and it concerns an organization called Aspire Public Schools. Aspire is a nonprofit that operates 38 K-12 charter schools. Many of them, most of them in fact, are in California, and a lot of them are here in the Bay Area. Our first presenter for this session is Lindsay Ziegenhagen, who led the technology innovation team at Aspire from 2008 to 2013. In this case study, Lindsay will walk us through the steps that enabled her and her colleagues at Aspire to build not just a set of data management tools, but a truly data-driven culture. Lindsay came to Aspire with a background that well prepared her for this challenge. She earned an undergraduate degree in symbolic systems here at Stanford, and then a master's degree in computer science at the Naval Postgraduate School. She then worked for companies such as Microsoft and the consulting firm Booz Allen, and she also ran a business of her own that developed software for a variety of nonprofit clients. After spending 5 years at Aspire, Lindsay worked with colleagues there to spin out a new organization called Schoolzilla. Schoolzilla is a for-profit benefit corporation that counts more than 50 school systems among its customers. And its mission is to help educators do more with data by applying tools and lessons like those that Lindsay's team developed at Aspire. Lindsay, who is Chief Executive Officer of Schoolzilla, will also talk today about her current work there to extend the Aspire model to other education organizations. Here to help Lindsay discuss this case is a second presenter, Neil Myrick. Neil is Director of Corporate Social Responsibility at Tableau Software. He's also head of the Tableau Foundation, which makes grants to support data-driven approaches to social change. Earlier in his career, he worked for two prominent technology companies, Aldus, which was later acquired by Adobe, and Visio, which was acquired by Microsoft. He then shifted to working for organizations in the nonprofit and philanthropic sectors. Today, Neil says he's really uniting those two aspects of his career by supporting philanthropy within a tech company. And it's in that role, as someone who bridges the worlds of tech and philanthropy, that Neil joins us today. So please welcome to the stage Neil Myrick and Lindsay Ziegenhagen.
Welcome.
Thank you.
You know, at the risk of sounding like a creepy stalker, I looked up on my computer this morning, and you and I met on May 29th, which is almost a year ago. And I remember being really impressed with Lindsay's work at Schoolzilla, and then when we were talking about this panel, I got to learn a bit more about her prior life and what she did at Aspire and even before Aspire. So I'm really interested in, you got started using data early in your career, so I'm really interested in hearing about sort of how you got started and sort of what got you on this track.
You know, I have been interested in data just personally ever since I can remember. Even in junior high, I have some stories I'll tell later. But the time when I first started doing it professionally, when I worked with nonprofits building software systems, often in order for them to fulfill the reports that funders were asking them to do. And that was starting about 15 years ago when the tools to do it were not very good. But it was kind of my first introduction to both how important it was to track the data, but also how it wasn't actually being used to actually make the organizations better often.
Do you remember anything in your early career where you sort of had that aha moment where you saw sort of the potential of data, or was it just more organic in the way it developed?
There are many cases in which I felt like a conversation that was about opinions could be grounded by an actual information in front of you. And whether that was when I was working at a consulting firm, working with large companies, I saw like real decisions that actually got changed when the data did not agree with somebody's kind of preconceived notion.
Oh, wow.
I think it's more like the small decisions every day that I was always impressed with, that data could change and shape how those conversations were happening more than one particular moment.
Cool. So when you went to Aspire, I understand that they sort of had a data culture, but it was still hard. So tell us a bit about sort of what it was like when you started.
Sure.
And sort of what the process was that you went through to help them get to where they were.
Sure. So Aspire I joined Aspire in about 2007, 2008, and they had already built a data culture in the sense that when they hired teachers, they asked them, one of the questions was about, to give an example of using data. It was built into the professional development. It was part of the review process. So they had many of the things that are actually very hard to build, but what they didn't have was fast and efficient ways to actually use data. So we did a survey early on, soon after I joined, on how people spent their data time and how much data time they spent. And teachers reported spending 80% of their time actually gathering and linking the data. So going to different systems, downloading files, typing into Excel, and that left like maybe 15 minutes a week to actually look at the data and try to see which kids are struggling with what and come up with plans to do something differently so that they get different results the next week, or to come up with a plan to help that particular child.
And they were willing to spend all this time entering the data because it was expected as part of when they were hired at Aspire? Because what we see a lot is that people want to be data focused, but actually motivating people to actually enter the data somewhere is difficult.
Yeah, in education, there are lots of compliance requirements that you have to report to some other entity, either to get funded or it's part of kind of what you have to do. So a lot of it started from that. I would say the other half of data actually has been gathered because it makes the school more efficient, like taking attendance on a piece of paper and then having to add it up later to figure out how many students are not coming to school. So over the last 20 years, more and more systems have been put into place to either make things more efficient because there's a new compliance requirement, and then more recently, there's actually been systems that students are using directly to do learning that also generate data. And
did you have, when you were at Aspire, did you have resistors, like people who sort of resisted the process and using data?
Yeah, I think like all organizations, there's a huge variety. I think it was often the complaints we heard were just that it was too hard and took too much effort. And that was what, when I first got there, we spent several months going around talking to teachers and principals and financial analysts and the HR team and instructional coaches, and just asking, what reports do you have to do? Can I see examples of them? What questions do you have that it's too much work to get answers to right now, but that actually would help you do your job better or help you serve kids better? And then what software systems do you use? What data isn't being entered anywhere? And from kind of starting in a position where we were like, we want to help make your job easier. We want to save you time. We want to help you answer that thing that you think you won't ever be able to know. I think that really helped build credibility with our team. And very few people are resistant to you making their job easier. So if you start from that approach and more successful, that was pretty effective for us.
Great. And I think you started answering this. So you hear a lot in these conferences like this about a culture of data. So if you think about Aspire, it sounds like at the beginning they sort of set that expectation when people were hired. But was the process that you followed to get feedback and make the job easier, were there any other aspects to that really helped build the data culture at Aspire?
Yeah, I think at Aspire they call it data-driven culture sometimes. Sometimes they call it a continuous improvement cycle that probably many of you have seen. There's a part that's like looking at the data, acting, seeing what worked, planning, and there's just an appreciation that the work that Aspire does is to prepare every child for college, and they've gotten 100% of their seniors accepted at four-year universities for 4 years running in places like East Palo Alto and Oakland. And you don't do that just through hard work. You actually have to do the right hard work. And I think at Aspire, there's a general belief that you cannot do that if you're not paying attention to what's working, what didn't work, with which kids or which schools, and why is that happening. And part of that is going in person, it's not all looking at data on a screen. It is also obviously supplemented by going into the classrooms and a lot of qualitative data as well.
Do you recall how you sort of trained the teachers to use the data and how to respond to what they were seeing?
Yeah, so actually one thing we were really careful to do was never to have my team train teachers, that it was always the person that they had relied on for years to give them information about the practice that they were being trained on. So for example, an instructional leader should be the one that's explaining how to use the dashboard to personalize instruction or to figure out what to reteach, and that it is not a technology person explaining that, and that the instructional coaches are helping explain dashboards to teachers on preparing for the first day of school. So I think a lot of what we did was make sure that we were empowering the people that had the respect, they had the domain knowledge about what you're actually supposed to do with that data.
Oh, that's good. And you mentioned this earlier, the tools. So
Yeah.
Can you give a little history of sort of the migration of what you started with and then how you sort of learned and built on the tool set and made things easier, hopefully, for people?
Yeah, sure. So after we did that initial month of asking people what reports take them a long time and were painful, we went and I bought a desktop license of Tableau, which is it's a visualization tool where you can create pretty reports very quickly. And we basically were able to replicate a lot of reports that were taking people hours and hours and hours very quickly. And so that started, well, people were grateful, and then they said, oh, can it do this, or can you answer this question? And then we started building more support for getting kind of a bigger investment than what me and at that time the one woman on my team was doing. So we were able to write a grant, we got a much bigger grant, and over time built a data warehouse, and as well as way more kind of visualization tools on top of that over the course of 5 years.
How about on the data entry side? Did it start with sort of paper and Excel and then move to other tools, or?
Yeah, so the data originally was the same way they were getting it now, which is they exported it from systems that already existed, typically in Excel. So that most of our reports initially were from Excel. We also, many software systems actually have a database in the back, and nobody kind of was using that data at Aspire. So we also were able to create reports that were pulling live from the data in the underlying database of the student information system. And then in large organizations like Aspire, or that have kind of hundreds of people or thousands of people, data distribution tends to be a really big problem too, that even if you have this beautiful report, now I have to get a personalized version of this to 400 teachers. That itself is another problem if you've used a tool like Excel. And so that was the other part, is that we got the other part of Tableau, which is Tableau Server, that lets you actually publish a report, and then you can like create the report once, and then every one of the 400 teachers goes to that report and sees their version with their students on it. So suddenly it took, instead of a month that it took the person who used to create the 300, like he created 300 reports individually for 300 teachers, and we were able to like just create one and send that out the day after the results came in, opposed to a month later.
Oh, that's cool. You know, one thing that we hear often is that funders don't fund this stuff. So they don't fund technology, they don't fund the staff resources, the technical and data staff resources. Nancy mentioned it this morning in a very compelling way, basically saying that I think data scientists are not overhead, I think is what she said this morning. So how did you fund this? And then how were you successful in getting a funder to actually help?
I think we got 3 different funders that funded our efforts at Aspire, and the first one was very much on, it wasn't about the data, it was we need to identify which kids are at risk of dropping out of high school as soon as possible and figure out what the risk factors are and do something about it. And so it was much more like, we want to increase our graduation rate and our retention rate, and this is one of the 4 tools in this grant to do that. So it was less about, this is a grant for data. And then the second one was actually more of a, we are scaling our organization from 18 schools when I got there to 34 when I left 2 years ago. And we cannot do this efficiently without automating processes. And part of that is actually about data, like moving data between places, automating reports that take a month down to a day or an hour. So a lot of that was kind of sold on the, we will be cheaper for you to fund per student in the future. And the third grant was a federal grant that was actually about sharing successful practices. So, and Schoolzilla in part came out of that because the federal government gave a grant that wanted us to create something that could be scaled to serve more school systems than just Aspire's.
Gotcha. People later are probably going to ask for the names of those funders. Yeah. So just be
You've
just
heard
be
of them
careful.
all.
So you were successful at Aspire, and then you decided to leave and start Schoolzilla. So talk us through sort of that thought process and what led you to do that.
Yeah, it was very much a joint decision. It wasn't kind of just me. Other school systems started asking us for our tools, and they would say, oh, I saw what the principals at your school have. Like, can you get that for my principals? Or can you respond to our RFP? And initially I was like, I'd love to help you. And I spent a lot of time on the phone and people on my team about what we did right and what went wrong and what our recommendations were. But eventually, kind of when the 4th other school system asked that, I think the CEO and the board and I were all like, maybe we should do this. Like, maybe the market isn't solving this problem in a way that actually works for schools. And part of Aspire's mission is to scale successful practices. And this seemed like technology's a thing that actually can really scale. And most school systems in this country are actually quite small and not of the size and often not in a place to hire the type of talent to solve this problem. And so it was kind of over the course of a year it was both demand was happening, we kept getting more demand, and the board and the CEO of Aspire were supportive. So that was when we spun out as a separate entity, but still with a very close relationship with Aspire. They own part of the company, a small minority stake in the company, and have a board seat.
Wow. And then when you talk about sort of starting to build Schoolzilla and kind of who'd you bring on first? Did you hire a data scientist right away? How was your process there?
So there's 6 of us that spun out into Schoolzilla to start, and now we are 60 people. And it's a combination, I think, to do data right. It's not just about the technologists, right? You do need great data people, you need great data visualization people, you need people that can actually work with customers to figure out what problem is most important for them to solve and kind of match capabilities, their needs. You need people that can build capacity of the internal staff in the school system. So we have a variety of skills. We have web tools that help accelerate the use of data that help support kind of curation of reports. And so I think it was a variety. I think we really hire for people that care about the mission and have a personal reason to care about education, especially of underserved kids in underserved communities. And so that helps kind of keep people, I think, focused on what's really gonna help our schools, not just be excited about data for data's sake.
Gotcha. I don't think everybody here in the room actually knows what Schoolzilla is, so you can give us a rundown of what you do and...
Sure, so we basically do the same thing we did for Aspire, which is we help school systems actually see what is going on in their school system. And we historically, So we have a data warehouse and reporting platform, and we also let people kind of create and answer their own questions on our platform. And one of because we offer it as a subscription, as a service, we're able to serve school systems that are like 1,000 or 2,000 kids all the way up to the very large ones. And historically, like this type of technology started at $500,000 and took a year to implement. And so unless you had 50,000 kids, it was gonna be beyond your budget. And now, we're at like $15,000 instead of $500,000. And I think it's just a good example of what can happen with technology these days and the tools that are available, that like things can be scaled in a way that's like affordable and for organizations of all sizes.
And when you go into a new school, do you have people that then help them adopt the tool, and how do you have to go in and actually help them build a culture of data in that school, or how does that work? Actually? Yeah,
so it's interesting. Our initial customers were actually, I would say, in the top 5% of most data-driven school systems in the country. There are a lot of the high-achieving charter management organizations like Aspire. And in those places, they also had already kind of built the data, and they had strong talent in the organization and strong opinions about what the data should, like what should teachers be looking at, what's helpful for principals. As we kind of now are working with more diverse groups of school systems, we actually are being asked more to, like, it's not enough, obviously, just to have the perfect report at the right time, that there's also the, like, I didn't hire people with the expectation that they would look at data, or I don't have the instructional coach to sit with that person to tell them what to do about the results. So we are actually starting more to partner with other organizations that is their expertise, and there actually are quite a few, especially in education around specific topics like equity and discipline, or using data to inform instruction, or like making better choices around like how you spend money in schools to optimize things for students.
Cool. I think we're going to move to Q&A here in a minute, but one last question. Just can you give me a specific sort of example of how a teacher would use Schoolzilla? And then if you have any stories about a particular teacher or school, it'd be great to hear a really specific sort of impact story.
Sure. So one story, it's actually at a principal level, but a principal is looking at discipline incidents over time, over the last 3 years. It was a middle school, and they noticed that like every January, right after the break, there's this like huge spike. So at the beginning of the school year, there's a bunch of incidents, students are kind of getting with the program, they understand the rules and expectations, and then they come back from break, and it kind of makes sense that they forgot all those rules. And they saw this in like October, and they were like, I know how to solve that problem. Because the problem, when there's a lot of negative behavior incidents, it takes principal time, it takes teacher time, it takes instructional time away, because everyone's dealing with the student that's, misbehaving or distracting everyone else. So that's why it matters kind of for instruction. So this principal and his team were like, I can do something about that. So they kind of planned the day kids got back, kind of a refresher of what the school norms were. And this year and last year, they actually had a total flat, like that didn't happen. And it was a simple little intervention, but actually affected kids and how much they learned. I think another thing at Aspire, we actually were able to take usage data. So we took data from Tableau Server about which teachers, how many times they visited the portal, and which reports they looked at, and we compared it to the growth of their students. So basically how much their students learned in a year. And we're able to, a researcher at UC Davis was able to show that there was a positive and statistically significant impact, especially for the kids that started out low. And the idea, they interviewed a bunch of the teachers, and it turns out that they don't always know, teachers don't always know at their fingertips which kids didn't master the thing that they just taught. And having clear visual ways to do that happen the day after you give the assessment actually enables them to be like, I am gonna make sure I reteach this to these kids, or I'm gonna give extra attention to them. So there are a lot of both anecdotal and kind of data showing that it can really help, especially the kids that probably need it the most.
Well, that's great. And it's interesting because when we look for projects to invest in with our foundation, we're constantly looking for organizations that are using data in that daily, active, iterative way. Historical M&E reporting has its value, but where we see the most impact are the cases where they can see a dashboard, ask questions of the data, and make a decision right then and there about what to do next, which is cool. So it's great to hear that.
Yeah, I think in any complicated organization, especially if it's with people, it's not so much the one magic insight that's gonna like save some child or help some teacher. It's like the millions of little decisions that they can make a little bit better every day and that ultimately have huge impacts on kids. And
yeah. Well, great. I think we can answer some questions now, and this is being filmed, so please make sure you go up to the microphones and don't everybody rush at once.
Hi.
Go ahead.
I'm curious if you could just kind of talk again about how you made that shift in resources when the staff was spending so much of their data time on inefficient kind of tasks. Where did you make the shift change? Was it in the reporting? About how long did that take, and maybe some costs?
Sure. First of all, because we first asked what was taking the most time, we were able to focus on that first, even if we're like, this is not gonna move the needle for children. But we decided that actually, if I can give a teacher back an hour a week of time, they can do lots of great things with that time that aren't about data that will move the needle. So I think, first of all, not focusing on the thing that you think's the data thing that's gonna make the biggest impact directly, but the thing that will give them back time, I think was really important for us. And the way we actually did it was by automating the data in one place and then creating reports on top of that were also web-based using Tableau Server, where you just create it once, it updates itself all the time. So it's always just there. You go to a web page. And we initially got a $3 million grant for 3 years, which I decided also to hire internally, because I could hire people, 3 people for the price of 1 external person. And we were able to hire really good folks. So that was one way I saved a lot of money initially, and we're able to go further and built a lot of capacity.
Over here.
Speak a little bit more about the tension between setting up the systems to collect your data and the tools to analyze your data. And you talked about that in real time, but for those of us who are sort of looking to improve how we're using data and implementing, how are, deciding between if we can't just consult it out and spend the summer setting up our data collection tools, how to sort of navigate that tension between the time spent on those 2 components of the process? Yeah, I always think it's better to create demand before you ask someone to do something. We found that there's one department that the data was incredibly dirty, and we couldn't find the right person in that department to care about fixing it. So for a year, I feel like we tried all sorts of strategies to get them to spend some time cleaning it up. And what finally worked was we trained somebody in their department to use Tableau, the reporting tool, and she created this amazing report with their horribly dirty data, showed it to the woman who ran the department, and the woman's like, that is if I could have that report, but it's wrong. And I was like, I was like, yes, it's wrong because the IDs don't match the IDs here. But if you actually spent 4 hours cleaning that up, it would be right, and you could have it every day. And then suddenly it was like mountains were moving, right? 3 people were put on the task, and it finally happened. So I think that has also happened when you create a report and there's some gap in the data, and suddenly they want to fill it. Not you saying, oh, it's good for you. Eat your vegetables. You'll be really happy later when you're strong.
We actually see that in a project in West Africa that we invested in, where the old way of doing it was community health workers would record information on paper, it would get hand typed into Excel and then moved into Access. And the people who were hand typing the data into access in Excel would never see the end result.
Yeah.
And so data quality was bad. Sometimes they would just enter zeros across an entire row because nobody's really monitoring it. And then once the system got in place where the data was being collected on a mobile device, put into a report that got sent back down within an hour to the end users, data quality improved. Everybody just got really excited because they could actually see the result of the work that they were putting into it. And so my advice would be, and I think you agree with this as well, we talked about this
Absolutely.
earlier,
Yeah.
is don't go for the big bang,
Yeah.
but just find one little thing that you can start with and build on that. And it's all about iteration, rapid development, rapid improvement. And I think you'll be amazed at how quickly you can actually overcome some of that tension if you just start small and start in kind of one place where you know you can get a good start.
And one other thing is like also be strategic about who to work with. Like don't try to, like I would say aim for the person who's so hungry for that report and they will go socialize it with other people opposed to the person that's like, why should I look at data? How is that important? I don't need that. Like I think letting other people do that for you sometimes helps.
Yeah, don't start with Eeyore because,
Yeah.
you know. Last question, please.
Yeah, my question is about the trade-off between standardization and customization. And I was wondering, you mentioned that you're dealing with a more diverse set of schools. Did you find that as you did that, a more standardized approach, brought a lot of value, and having them kind of buy into that was the biggest way to make an impact, as opposed to with the first schools where you were trying to solve their major problem? Right.
Do you mean in the like standardization and which reports they should be, like teachers should look at, for example?
Right. I guess it's the question of how much is it very much tailored to their priorities, et cetera, and how much of it is that it's a bigger value to kind of bring to them something that, in a sense, they adopt.
Yeah. We are more moving towards, like we have way more we bring when we turn when we light up a customer's site than we used to for that reason. What you find is if people haven't actually been creating reports for themselves, it's really hard for them to explain what they want, and it is so much more valuable to give them something. It's almost so they have an opinion about it once you give it to them, but it's much, we have learned, like, yes. Answer your question, yes. I should have just said yes. That is exactly what we're learning. I guess part of me still feels like some of the most important questions are in the 20% of questions that are unique to their local situation. Like the speaker this morning that talked about how he needs to partner with another organization who works in another country that knows the local context. I think that is very true in schools as well, and that we will never come with every report with every answer. And it's important to give schools the capability to answer more questions themselves. So I would say yes and maybe.
Yes, and
Yes
maybe.
and.
Awesome. Well, Lindsay, thank you so much. It's been
Yeah,
really
thank
helpful, and thank you for your time today.